As readers, when we work with informational text, and we know particularly that the purpose is to inform, it's important that we be able to define and determine main ideas of text. We do this through identifying those key details so that we're able to explain how the key details support a main idea. By looking for details, it helps lead us to being able to define a summary and even write a summary of a text. Now, this is extremely important as we work to closely read a text. And close reading means we need to examine a text more than just reading it one time and being done. So we're going to strengthen our strategies for close reading with a passage about immigration. Now, I like to think about finding a big idea in a text. Sometimes a main idea or a big idea can be explicitly stated for us in titles and headings, and even in perhaps the initial sentences of paragraphs. And at other times, we have to be more of a detective and go below the surface to look for those main ideas and key details. So I like to look for patterns as a reader. And when I look for patterns as a reader, often I find perhaps words that have been repeated throughout a text, or I might find related ideas, which are words that have similar type meanings or even phrases. And so when we think about something being related, it's perhaps similar in meaning. We can even think of synonyms. Through finding repeated words and related ideas, that's when I'm able to start drawing conclusions. And so those conclusions help me get to what a main idea is of a text. And these repeated words and related ideas help me identify key details. So let's practice looking for patterns or repetition in related words and related ideas. Now, when working with a shorter article or text, I know that these are not organized into chapters or sections, so often it's helpful for me to label paragraphs. And so I'm working with paragraph 1 here. I've already read this short article on immigration, as you should have. And now I'm going back to look more closely. And I remember from my initial reading of this article that I saw United States and America come up throughout this, and of course the word immigrants. And so as I'm going through again, I notice that I am reading immigrants again. Check this out. We have leaves or left coming up more than once. Here it is again. Leave. Feared is also an idea that I know comes up. We have dangers. Fear and danger are definitely related ideas. Of course, again, we have immigrants left. And then we have immigrants left. And sacrifice is also an idea that I feel is perhaps related to danger. So these are some of the words just in this first paragraph that I found that are repeated words or repeated ideas. As I continue on with this article or passage, I've got paragraphs 2 and 3 here that I'm working with. And before I go too much further, I want to point out a feature that this particular text has that you will come across as readers. You notice these are small numbers. And if you notice down here, this is at the bottom of the page, we have these small numbers. These are called footnotes. Footnotes are kind of like a mini dictionary provided for you right within a text. So here the author has realized that there are probably some words that you would need the definitions for. And so they've indicated those words in bold print. And then they've identified a footnote with corresponding numbers to give you the definition. So that's important to note as readers. And of course, when an author does that, it does tell us, hey, these are key words here. Now, reading on in these next two paragraphs, I'm continuing on finding repetition with words. Of course, again, I have United States and I have immigrants. It's definitely a repeated word. It's interesting, though, in contrast to the United States, I have noted that I have other countries. While they're not repeated, it gives me an important sense of location. So I'm going to mark those. Reading on, I see the word escape, which of course is related to left. And then looking down here at persecution, treating someone cruelly or unfairly, I feel like this relates to perhaps fear and danger and sacrifice. So I'm going to note that. Of course, I have immigrated and American again. And then also in this paragraph, looks like I could consider sold into slavery, kind of going along with that fear or related idea. Paragraph 3 continues with the United States. And here I remember reading waves. There are 3 waves in this particular article. I know we read a text that talked about 4 waves. This piece gives us information about 3. More repetition, of course, of immigration in America. Immigrants again. And it's interesting as I notice I've got different areas here being mentioned of where people were coming from. I forgot about West Africa up there. German and Chinese and Ireland. Again, escape being repeated. And famine, a lack of food, so that suggests to me perhaps sacrifice or danger, so that would be another word that I would note as being repeated as an idea or related, I guess. Immigrants and wave again. So certainly we're building a sense that this text is mostly about immigration to the United States. Okay, we're on to paragraph 4 and paragraph 5 here. Continuing to look for repeated words or ideas. So, of course, immigrants in America. We have that idea of fear again. We have another footnote. I don't have it on this particular slide, but we do have discriminated against. And if you look on your passage, it's being treated differently or unfairly. And so we have this here repeated. Of course, we have immigrants. And then we have suffered. I think that's related to some of the other words that we've already found with fear and sacrifice. We have waves again and immigration. Immigrated, United States. So really what we're just doing is we're training our eyes to find these words as we read. We obviously don't annotate everything we read, but by doing this for practice, we're training our brains to look for these things. I want to point out the idea of anti. It is a root meaning against, and so I think that that might be related to some of the other things that we found. Let's see, we've got words like, how about undesirable? That's definitely very negative here. I think it goes along with discrimination. We have exclusion here, which is being kept out or shut out, which also goes along with the idea of discrimination. And I would even connect it to perhaps suffering. Let me see if I'm still looking here. Immigrants again. Oh, people leaving America. We've got America down here at the bottom. Can't get underneath it. I think I saw wave again. Let's check and see. Oh, of course we have people leaving as well. So this idea of leaving and left is definitely repeated. Okay, moving on to the 6th and 7th paragraphs of the article here. I'm continuing to look for these repeated words or ideas. Of course, again, I have wave and immigration. Immigrants and wave. Of course, here we have different areas now coming in, which is just interesting to note as it fits into where people are coming from. Right, immigrants again. Paragraph 7. Idea. Here, I feel this connects to our related ideas where we have hatred and fear and discrimination. Negative, kind of fitting along. So I've gone through and I think I've identified any repetition in words or ideas in this text. Now, as I look back in my text again, I know that I found several repeated words. I found the United States. I found repetition with the idea of immigrant and immigration. And even immigrated. And then American or America. And then waves. So those are words that were repeated throughout. When I looked back at my related ideas, I found words like leaves or left. Found fear or feared. A lot of negative words like dangers and sacrifice. Escape. Persecution. Remember that was one in the footnotes. Famine. Discriminated. Or discrimination being related. So I have a lot of words with similar type meanings. Oops, discrimination. Okay, suffered, which I feel suffered and sacrifice are very much related. Got that idea of anti or to be against something. Undesirable. Hatred. Even that word negative. And exclusion. Now that I've really thought carefully about these repeated words and these related ideas, I have some of my own personal conclusions that I can draw about the big idea, which is what I'd like you to do. Certainly, you've got the idea of immigration and waves, and you've got the idea of immigration to the United States or America as part of our big idea. But as you look at some of these other related ideas, what conclusion might you draw about immigration, or should I say about waves, of immigration to America. Just put to U.S. So what does all of this make you think? That'll be a great discussion point. Now, because we determined that part of the big idea of this text is this idea of waves of immigration, I think it's important that we go back and kind of just identify all of the waves. In contrast to the story of immigration text that we read, which identified 4 waves, this text clearly states that there were 3 waves. And so we're going to peek back into this text for some examples of these waves. We know people were coming, so by looking back at the waves, we're going to figure out why they came and from where they came. So as I go back through and I look for the why and the where, I'm going to grab a highlighter here. And back in paragraph 1, why? I've got, well, some felt forced to leave because they feared for their lives due to the dangers present in their home countries. They left countries that were at war or that didn't give them freedom to practice their faith. They left their native lands if they couldn't find work or enough food to live. And so these are some of the why from paragraph 1. In paragraph 2, they don't designate this as a wave, but they do indicate that from the 1600s to 1775, we have European colonists settling in what is now United States. So they came from Europe. They came looking for economic opportunity or better land to farm or better work. Some came to escape. And we have others that were brought as slaves. In paragraph 3, then, this is where it identifies our 3 waves. So this first part up here is information from the 1600s to 1775, which isn't necessarily being declared a wave. But it's important to note because this is how people first came to the country. So now we have information that gets into the actual waves because, and the text does count everything that happened prior to the late 1700s as before the United States was established. So here we have this first wave of immigration from 1820 to 1870. And in terms of important information, people are coming from Northern and Western Europe. We've got a third that were Irish, escaping a famine. And we've got another third that's German. And then we also know that the Chinese were coming as well. Now, paragraph 4 continues with what's happening in that first wave by mentioning that they weren't always welcome and that people feared them. So we've got wasn't always welcome. They were feared or just not liked because of other reasons. So this led to discrimination. Paragraph 5 gets into our next wave, or we can certainly infer it's the second wave. So we have wave number 2. And important information in this section is that it started in 1880 and ended in 1920. Let's see, we have people coming from Southern and Eastern Europe in this. But at this time, we have people demanding laws to make it harder. So some examples of that is we have a law intended to limit. Let's see, we have laws that require literacy skills. We have the Chinese Exclusion Act. Let's see, we have limiting numbers from areas. Oh, here we have 1882 is the Chinese Exclusion Act. Oh, here it is, 1875, keeping people who were undesirable. So those are some of the key details about this second wave. Okay, and finally, let's pull out the important information from the final paragraphs about the third wave. It says it began in 1965, and it's still going on today. We have people coming from Asian countries, South American countries, Caribbean, and Mexico. So those are some of the things that are important to note. Of course, the final or the seventh paragraph more wraps everything up. So we found all of the important information about each of these waves, and we're ready to take some notes. So here's my note catcher for the various waves, keeping in mind that this particular text considers all of the immigration or coming to America from the 1600s to 1775 as what's happening before the United States was a country. So all of this before the Revolutionary War. The information in these sections notes that people are mostly coming from Europe. They're coming for opportunities. Oops, gotta spell that right. For better land and work. Some are escaping. They were escaping that religious, or escaping for religious freedom or for being persecuted. And then, of course, we have slaves. So I'm just capturing some of the key details here in this note. Then we move on to what happens in wave number one. And wave number one in this text was indicated as being from 1820 to 1870. And while this may contradict some information that we read in other texts, this is why we read from multiple sources, to gather information so that we can see how different texts deal with the same topic. In this wave, according to this text, people came from Northern and Western Europe. It explicitly stated that 1/3 of these people were coming from Ireland or were Irish. 1/3 were German. Now, it did not explicitly state that the other third was Chinese, but it did say at this time this is where people were coming from China or were Chinese. Then moving on to wave two, which according to this text is indicated as occurring from 1881 to 1920. And in wave two, it points out that we have people coming now from Southern and Eastern Europe. During this time, we had people that were already living in the United States demanding laws be passed. So this gets into what we looked at in the previous text with problem and solution. So in the demanding of these laws, some of the laws were requiring that people have literacy skills. Could they read or write? Some of these laws were limiting people from certain areas. And that's where we have the one noted as 1875, limiting just numbers of people in general. And of course, my mind is connecting to what we read in the other text about a Quota Act. So we'll put limiting numbers. And then we also have in 1882, it was that Chinese Exclusion Act. Then we move on to wave three, which according to this text is being identified as 1965 to today. And while there's not a lot of information about this particular wave, we did note that we have people coming from Asian countries, from South American countries, from Caribbean countries, and from Mexico. And so now that I've gathered the information from these texts, I'm able to go back to drawing a lot of my own conclusions. For example, just by looking at this information, I can start to notice that I have people who are coming from Europe, it seems like initially, and then Asia. But now, today, I notice that we have Asia, South American countries, and it's not so much from Europe anymore. So this is why it's important to read information carefully and closely so that you can pull out what the text is saying and you can compare that information to other things that you've read. This is important for you to do so that you are a responsible reader.